The following lecture is from my Udemy course, Complete 3D Animation Masterclass, Cree Animated Shorts. If you like my teaching style and are interested in taking your skills from intermediate or beginner to advanced 3D artists, consider enrolling in my course. Link in the bio. All right, so now that we know our way around Maya with a camera, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can pair this with the movement tools to start moving things in our scene and building out 3D space. So I'm going to click on a cube again. If you already have yours, just keep it there. And we're going to take a look at how we can move this cube now. The way we're going to do this is through our tool panel using the various move tools. So let's go ahead and go through the first tool here, which is going to be our move tool or translate tool. So this one here, it looks like a square with the arrows sticking out the side. We can think of this as our move tool, or what we would refer to as a translate tool. Now, I'm using the term translate to correlate to what we'll see over here in our channel box. Let's go ahead and turn that on so we have access to it and we can see this in action. If you click on that move tool, your selection is going to change. And if you have your cube selected, you'll see it look like this. Now, if you click off of your cube, notice that goes away. If you click onto your cube, notice it comes back. Now, what we are seeing here is our movement gizmo. And the way this works is it is going to allow us to move along the individual axes. So let's go ahead and talk about the axes inside of our 3D space here, and what we might also refer to as the grid. So if you see this grid down here, it's dealing with axes. We have three primary axes. We have the x-axis, we have the y-axis, and we have the z-axis. So the x-axis is going to deal with our side-to-side movement, and it's going to be indicated in red. The y is going to have our up and down movements, and it's going to be located in green, or in this case, yellow, because I have it selected, but I'll put green next to it. Whichever one of these arrows you're clicked onto, it changes yellow. So you'll notice that there. I'll go ahead and add the colors here. So this one's going to be red. And then finally, your z-axis. Z is often referred to as Z. So if you're ever watching other tutorials, you may hear the term Z used. This is going to be your forward and backwards movement in terms of 3D space. So that will be indicated by blue. Now, green, red, and blue is the universal colors for 3D. So it doesn't matter if you're inside of Maya or another 3D program. Generally, those are going to be what green, red, and blue represent. And later on, when you get into a little bit more complex things, the green, red, and blue also represent the X, Y, and Z channels. All right. So X, Y, and Z is the same as saying red, green, and blue in many respects. You'll also notice they correlate over here to translate X, Y, and Z, and that's going to be how we move. Now, these arrows will move you purely in that axis. So let's say I wanted to move this cube up. I could click the arrow up and drag here, and you'll see I'm moving this up and down. Now, notice while I do this over in the channel box, the value for translate Y is changing. And that's because the channel box is tracking its location on the 3D grid. Now, let's say I wanted to move it side to side. I could click on the red arrow to move it side to side. And let's say I wanted to move it forward and backwards. I could click the blue arrow to move it forward and backwards. So you'll see that is going to allow me to move that purely along those axes. Now, in addition to being able to use the move tool, we can actually just type in values into the cube channel box here. So let's say I wanted to translate 10 units. I could click on the translate X channel box input here, type 10 for 10, and hit enter, and you'll be able to see the object move to the 10 location on the grid. Now, if I want to reset it to the center, I could do something called zeroing it out, which is essentially hitting 0 into the X, 0 into the Y, and 0 into the Z. And that's going to return us to the center of the world there. So that would be the concept of zeroing out. The last thing I want to talk about with the move tool here is going to be these little squares. These little squares allow you to move between axes, and they move between the two axes they're situated in. So let's say I grab this square here that my cursor's hovered over, and I move along here. This is going to be between the X and Z axes. So it's going to be flat on the ground. Let's say I grab this here. This is going to be between the Y and X. So that'll be moving up and down and sideways. Let's say I'm grabbing here, that'll be between Z and Y. I don't use these often, if ever. They're good for scene placement, but vast majority of the time for precise movement, you grab the axes you want to move in and you drag. All right, so that's going to be the move tool. Let's go ahead and zero this out. A quick way to zero this out is to click to the first value, shift click to the last over here, hit 0, and then type enter. And that will go ahead and do that quickly. The next tool to talk about is going to be the rotate tool, which you can access here. This is going to be the rotate. It looks like a circle with a square on it. And if we go ahead and click on this, you'll see that we gain a new gizmo that looks something like this. You'll notice some similarities, but quite a bit of differences here, where we have the red line, we have the blue line, we have the green line. Those are representing the axes once again for X, Y, and Z. What's different here is rather than pulling this along those, it's going to spin it along it. So what it does is it revolves around that axis. A great example is to look at Y. With Y, you essentially have this arrow sticking around here. And when we rotate this in Y, it's going to spin it. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's grab the green line here, which is Y, and we can just click that and drag it. And you'll see as I do that, this is going to rotate side to side. All right, so I'm just clicking and dragging and rotating. And you can see how that rotation is occurring. You'll see that you kind of have to move in a circle if you want to get that circular motion, but we can see that revolving and we can see a value going in rotate Y. Now, translates work on position data, meaning where they're located in the scene, whereas rotates are simply based on degrees. So that'll come into play later when animating because you can do spins. But when it comes to modeling, you have common angles, 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 90 degrees that you see a lot. Other things like 180 degrees to flip it the other direction or 360 degrees to return it to the beginning. Okay, so good to know. But you'll see you can grab any of these handles to perform this operation. Now, the final one is this blue handle here. This blue handle is a very interesting one, which is rotate based on camera position. So as you crank this dial, it's going to rotate X, Y, and Z relative to your camera. So it's going to make your camera that center area that it revolves around. This is very useful for scene block out and just kind of placing things in scene if you need to kind of match a reference. But it's not very useful outside of that. But at times it can be a useful lifesaver. So let's go ahead and zero these out. I'm going to click on the translate X, shift click down to Z, hit 0, and click enter. And that's going to return this back to the beginning. The final movement tool to take a look at is going to be our scale tool, which is located here. And it looks like a box getting slightly bigger inside of a bigger box. The scale is a very interesting concept because it's not something we have in real life. So move, rotate, okay, those are things we can understand in real life. But when you get into the scale tool, it's going to be responsible for making things bigger and smaller, as well as stretching them. With the scale tool, just like with the other ones, you have your Y-axis, which is going to stretch this upwards, your X-axis, which will stretch it sideways, and your Z-axis, which will stretch its depth. If we go ahead and use one of these by itself, you'll see it stretches in the direction that we click. So you can see that there. Now, if you want to stretch a little bit more, you can actually click off and just keep using the tool. So you can see I'm clicking off and redoing it, clicking off, redoing it. Okay, that's an easy way to do it. You could also change your camera to have more screen real estate. Same with X, you can see we can stretch this, and Z, we can stretch this. Now, you'll notice it's no longer a cube. We've turned it into a rectangular shape. So this is a great tool for just kind of shaping and blocking in forms. It can also be used to make something bigger or smaller, and this is one of the unique aspects of this tool, but at the center here, we have something called uniform scale. So what uniform scale does is it will scale all of the axes relative to each other. What that means is it makes it larger or smaller, but maintains its shape. So using the X, Y, and Z individually stretches the object out, but using the uniform scale at the center allows us to make it bigger or smaller. So if I go ahead and click that center dial here, I can increase the size of this, or I can decrease the size of it. And you'll see it stays relative to the other sizes. Like the translate tool, we also have the dual axes here, which is very interesting to look at, but not very practical for precision. So once again, it does the same thing. It's going to scale along both those axes together. The scale is also unique because when it comes to resetting this, let's say we want to get back to a cube, we don't zero it out. If you come over here and you zero this out, you'll see that our cube kind of disappears. And that's because something can't have a zero scale. You can think of scale as an aspect ratio, like 1:1, 1:2 type thing, or in this particular case, a percentage. And that's the better way to think about it. So if you have something that's it's its original form, to reset it would be to set it to 1. That's the start point. That's where it begins. Going beneath 1 into decimal points makes it smaller, and going above 1 makes it larger in multiplicatives. So right now, this is 17 times its original size. All right. So that's the idea there with scale. So now that we've taken a look at these, we're ready to start using them in interesting ways. But to really get into using them, let's talk about the hotkeys. These have specific hotkeys to them. W is going to be the move hotkey. E is going to be the rotate hotkey. And R is going to be the scale hotkey. You can remember it as were. That's what I like to remember it as. And if you want to throw an interesting one on top, we can actually throw Q on top, which is the default select tool we started in. That's this arrow one here. So let's say you wanted to select things without moving, you could use Q to do so. So let's go ahead and practice this. Let's go ahead and click off of this object. We're currently on the scale tool. Let's go ahead and press Q to switch to the select. Let's click on the cube and switch to W to move it. And let's move it to a different spot. Doesn't matter where, you can move it wherever you like. Let's switch to E to rotate it. And we can go ahead and click an axis here to rotate it specifically. Or if you want, you can actually click in this area here to kind of free tumble it. I forgot to mention that with the rotate, but if you click between the lines, that's kind of a hidden category. The ball you see is actually free tumble. It's a little bit different than camera orient. All right, but yeah, we can go ahead and click there. We can access that. And then finally, let's hit R and let's just go ahead and give this a bit of scale and some shape, and then maybe we'll make it a bit bigger to take up more space on our screen. And now we've used all the hotkeys. So W, E, R, if you throw in Q, Q, W, E, R, those are going to be the hotkeys for the main tools we're going to be using for menu. Q for select, W for move, E for rotate, R for scale. All right, so while we're on the topic of moving, scaling, and rotating, let's go ahead and talk about switching the movement space that you're operating in. So I'm going to start a fresh Maya scene by just coming up here to File and New Scene. This will give me a blank scene, and I'm going to go ahead and move the cube here. Okay, so we're going to grab a cube here. I'm going to hit W to move this thing. You can just move it around, and I'm going to go ahead and scale it maybe, and then rotate it. Now, why am I doing this? I want to show you the interactions between different tools. When I hit W, notice that the arrow is pointing upwards. If I hit scale, notice the scale is pointing outwards. And if I hit the rotate, notice it's revolving around the object. I have different spaces at work here inside of my tools. If you recall, I mentioned we could access that tool setting menu up here, and you'll see that it allows us to change the spaces in which we operate. Now, I'm going to close this, and I'm going to show you another trick. You can either use this button, or let's say I want to specifically access my move tools and switch to my move tool. I turned my move tool on by clicking it, and if I double click this, you'll see it'll bring up the tool settings. Now, there are a lot of tool settings for tools inside of Maya, so don't let this overwhelm you. I want you to put up your blinders, and I want you to just look in this top section here, the axis orientation. You'll see this is currently set to something called world. There's two common spaces that we're going to operate in, world space, and the other one is going to be called object space. Now, with these spaces, we can use them with either tool. And if I leave this tool menu up and I switch to my rotate, you'll see my rotate's an object, and you'll see my scale as an object. This may be completely different than what yours are set to. So I want to give you a heads up on that. If my matching exercise didn't go quite like yours, It might be because your tools are in a different space. Unfortunately, Maya likes to copy my preferences. Even though I did a fresh install, it seems like it kept my old preferences. Now, let's talk about the difference between these spaces and how they operate. They're going to change the orientation of your axes in respect to something. If I go ahead and click the drop-down menu here and switch to Object, you'll see that all of a sudden my axes start to follow the directionality of my object like the scale and rotate were. You'll also see several others. We're not going to get to those because world and object are really the most useful ones. But what this is going to do is it's going to switch between those spaces. So what does that mean? Well, let's talk about the spaces. Let's go ahead and start off with talking about what world space means. World space means in correlation to the world. So if I had a little character on the world here, and the character was standing here, and we asked the world, where is the character relative to your position? The character would be up, right? But if the character was down, instead, down here, it'd be downwards, right? So it'd be down. So it's in respect to the world itself, okay? So what that means is when we're in world space, up is always up, down is always down, left is always left, right's always left, z is always forward, backwards, no matter what the position of our object is. So in short, world space doesn't care about rotation. So let's say I wanted to just move this straight up and down. World space is going to be the space to do that in because it's relative to the world. It's not relative to the object. So let's go ahead and talk about object space. Object space is aware of the object rather than the world. So let's say we had something like a bottle of soda or whatever this is, and I were to turn the bottle upside down, and I were to ask you, where is the top of the bottle? What's the top of the bottle? You would say, this is the top of the bottle, right? Because that's the top of the bottle. But world space would say that this is the top of the bottle, right? Because whatever side is facing upward is the world. So object space is going to be what is aware of the positioning of the object. So aware of the object relative to itself, okay? So world space is relative to the world. Object space is relative to the object. So let's say instead of wanting to move this up here, I wanted to move it in the direction of the tilt of the object. I could switch that to object space. And now you'll see it's going to be moving along the orientation of what's up in respect to the object rather than in respect to the world. Okay, so that's going to be world space, where everything is always upwards, always sideways, always forward, backwards, and object space, which is relative to the object. This applies to all of the channels. So if I come over here to rotate, you'll see we're currently rotating relative to object space. But if I switch to world space, you'll see that it will go back to always up, so on and so forth. Same with scale. And scale is actually a really interesting one because it makes a huge difference in terms of shaping things, if you're using it as that sort of means. But, let's switch to world, and all of a sudden you can get a really weird shape. And this might have thrown you for a loop on the last one, depending on what space you're in. You can see it makes a world of difference. Terrible joke there. Okay, so that is going to be the two spaces. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, we're ready to start exploring a concept called primitive modeling. So let's go ahead and start creating our first models. All right, so let's go ahead and start our journey into 3D by doing some primitive modeling. Primitive modeling refers to using geometric primitives to construct objects. It's the most basic form of modeling and the earliest form of 3D modeling in a certain sense that ever happened. Now, primitives are what we make by default. They're called geometric primitives because they're using primitive geometry to create a precise object that can be manipulated. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and use these to create a little forest set, and we'll start by creating our first tree. Now, to create a nice cartoony stylized tree, we can start by using some cone shapes here. So we can access the cone here, or we can access it through the Create menu. Now, I haven't shown you the Create menu, but we're going to start using this increasingly in future projects, so let's go ahead and explore this. The Create menu contains a wide array of different things we can create, which are essentially objects that enter the Maya scene space. And in here, the menu we're concerned with is called the polygon primitives. This is going to be where the primitives live that we've been accessing. Now, you'll see in here, there's actually a lot more than what we were using previously, but they do have the same ones. Now, for this, I'm going to start by using a cone to create the basis of my tree. If I go ahead and grab this cone now, I can move it upward in space, and I can use the scale tool by hitting R to scale it a bit and maybe make it a little bit wider, maybe squash it a little bit here to create the basic shape of a tree. Now, when modeling, we generally want to model above what's called 0, 0. So this ground plane here, this is going to be where we want to count as sort of our floor. So that's why I lifted this up. And most trees, they have a trunk. You could probably just use a little triangle here to represent a tree. Let's go ahead and grab a trunk for this. I'm going to use a cylinder. We can go to create polygon primitives, and we can create a cylinder. And we can go ahead and move this up. Now from here, we can kind of position our tree in respect to that. Look at that, we made a beautiful tree, but it sure would be nice if it had a little bit more appeal to it. We could add some more appeal to it by stacking some cones on each other, maybe changing their position a little and actually building up the structure of a tree. So let's go ahead and do that. The way we're going to do this is by trying out the duplicate command. We've already explored the create menu. We've already created plenty of objects from here. So let's introduce a really convenient hotkey. I'm going to hit W to switch to my move tool so I can move the duplicate I make. And I'm going to use the hotkeys Control D to duplicate this. All right. So you're going to hold down the Control key and then tap D, and that will make a duplicate. Now, you may not notice because it's perfectly overlapping the original, but over in the outliner, you'll see we have 3 objects in our scene, not just 2. And I can move this upwards now to add another layer to my tree. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe rotate this a little bit, and we could play around with the scale on this if we want to give it a little bit more character. So for the bottom one, I'm going to scale this to be a little bit flatter and larger to kind of make the skirt of the tree here. And then this one, I'm going to make it a little bit flatter and a bit larger and just move it down to kind of create that second layer and just give it a little bit of a rotation for character. And then I'm going to duplicate it again. So Control D to duplicate. And this one I'll go ahead and maybe make a little bit skinnier. You can spend a little bit more time adjusting this, but something like that. And then I'll go ahead and Control D once more and make the top of the tree. Now, this tree is a little bit fatter than I wanted, so I'm going to just come back in here and spend some time adjusting this to look nice. But we can spend a bit of time here just adding some appeal to our little tree and making it into something that we would like to see. Okay, so that is going to give us one primitive little tree there. I'm still not a big fan of it. Let's spend some time adjusting it. I think my tree needs to go on a diet here. It's had a few too many cookies lately. There we go. That's starting to look nice. And I might change this up so it's not all just tilting in one direction. And since we're thinking in 3D, if you've only been rotating along one axis, consider rotating along another just to give your tree a little bit more life, a little bit more variety. So if we made a forest of these things, it would create some interesting angles to look at. And while we're at it, let's give the skirt a little bit of a tilt. And there we go. Cute little tree that we can go ahead and start using inside of a scene. So with that set, I might skinny up the trunk a bit and maybe make it a bit taller. Let's go ahead and talk about moving things together. Now that we're working with objects together, let's say I wanted to move all of these up together. Well, I could move one at a time, which would kind of take a while and not be that great. Or what I could do is I could move them as a unit. Now, I'm also going to use a hotkey here that you may be familiar with, which is Control Z to undo. So I'm going to undo those moves, Control Z here. And I'm going to use a hotkey called Shift to select multiple objects. So if you want to select multiple objects together, you can hold Shift and you can click an object to add. So I can Shift click, Shift click, Shift click, and you'll see that's going to add. But oops, I accidentally selected the bottom. I was so focused on showing Shift click, I clicked once too many times. Oh, I did that on purpose, my bad. So what if you want to remove from a selection? Let's say, hey, I accidentally selected one too many things. You can hold down Control, and Control click will remove. So I can Control click that and no longer in the selection. Okay. Now, if I move these, you can see we can move these together. We could also scale these together. We can rotate these together. Notice, however, they do rotate separately. Now, I'm still not really liking the top of this tree, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time here shaping this. I'd like this tree to look nice when it's all said and done. So I'll try not to be too nitpicky here, but trying to get it to be just right. Okay, so now that allows me to take this here and make it a little bit skinnier and maybe a little bit taller to just add a little bit more appealing trunk to our tree, so it doesn't look quite as much as a stump. Okay, so take some time crafting your tree. Go ahead and construct that out. So I'm gonna just toy around with my scale a little bit more here. Remember to use your object spaces if you need to. One of my issues I'm running into here with the scale is not following the object space. So I'm just gonna double click and switch that to object. Usually I like my scale to be an object space. Forgot to change it after last section, but there we go. All right, so that's gonna be my little tree there. And with that, I think we're ready to go ahead and move forward and talk about a little bit of scene management with this to make it a little bit easier to move. But as a challenge, what I want you to do is go ahead and build out a tree of your own. And once you're done with it, go ahead and come up here and do a File, Save Scene As. And in your Scenes folder, you can go ahead and set this to ASCII and just go ahead and save this out as tree or whatever you would like to name it. So I'm just going to save that as tree, and there we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and pause here. And then we're going to talk about groups next. All right, so let's go ahead and explore some scene management here and moving objects together. So we took a look in the previous section at using the shift method here to move things around, or select things at least, and be able to move them. But certain things like rotate don't work. Certain things like scale also don't work. What can we do to prevent that? Well, we can introduce something called groups. Now, in order to understand groups, you need to understand a little bit of what's going on inside of 3D and how objects are constructed. So let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit more in depth. What we can do is we can talk about how objects are built, or what we would consider the node structure. Okay, so I'm going to just select one of these and open the attribute editor so that you can see this visually. And over here in the attribute editor, you're going to see that we have several different nodes going on. That's going to be what you see over here. We have the P cone, the P shape, the initial shading group, and the Lambert. Each of these is responsible for some facet of what this object does. The first one here, which is the polycone, is going to be the transform. The transform node is going to be what deals with our move tool, our rotate tool, and our scale tool. So that's going to be what that first node does. So in short, that's going to make it respond to move, rotate, and scale. The poly shape here is actually going to be the geometry. What makes this different from our cylinder is basically what's contained in that cone shape in terms of the structure. The initial shading group and the Lambert are tied together, and that's going to be what makes it that gray color that we're seeing. And we'll explore how to change that soon, but that's essentially what's going on with every shape we make. So it contains three nodes: a transform, a geometry, and a shader. Now, the challenge is we essentially need to take all of these and we need to make their transforms agree with each other in some way. A way we can do that is by using a group. Now, grouping is one of the most basic forms of scene organization. And what it does is it allows you to nest multiple elements inside of Maya under a single transform. So what does that mean? Well, it means that instead of moving the objects individually, we can move the objects together. The way this is achieved is most easily through hotkeys. I'm going to show you the hotkey method, and I'm going to use the outliner. Now, just a reminder, if you guys don't have the outliner, you can open it right here by clicking this icon. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by clicking the top object in my outliner, and then I'm going to shift click down to the bottom here. So we're going to click this, we're going to shift click this here, and you can use the hotkey Control plus G to group. All right. Control G is going to allow you to group. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. I'm going to hit Control G, and you're going to see what happens here is we get something called group 1 over here. And you'll notice with group 1 selective, we have a single transform. So watch this. If I scale this now, it scales the whole thing. If I hit W and move, it moves the whole thing. And if I hit E to rotate, it rotates the whole thing. So now we have the ability to quickly move, scale, and rotate this. Now, what this forms is something called a hierarchy. And if you're not familiar with hierarchies essentially mean chain of command. So who's in charge of who? Now, I like to equate this a bit to like a family unit where the parents are generally in control, right? So if we're all going to the grocery store, the children have to come to the grocery store too, right? But once you get to the grocery store, those children aren't going to stay put. You know, you're going to have one child run it over to the magazines, one child run it over to the toys, someone's getting into the candy aisle, all the while, you know, parents doing the proper shopping. So you can think of the group as the parent. All the children have to go with the group because that's the parent, but the children still have their independence. So how do we give these children their independence? Well, if you click this plus icon here next to the group in the outliner, that's going to expand so you can see the individual children. The group is its own entity. It's not a visual object, but it's still a node that exists. So it is a real transform node. All our other pieces are still down here though. So if I still wanted to come in here and make adjustments to my tree in some way, shape, or form, I could do that. You can see all these still move independently. And once moved, they still move with the group as a whole. Okay. Now, the parent-child analogy is on purpose because when you're dealing with hierarchies, they actually refer to it as a parent-child relationship. So the way it works is the parent is on top and the child is underneath it. Okay. So grouping is the most basic form of hierarchies where we deal with parent-child relationships inside of Maya. So what's cool about that is now that we have this group, we can also do things like duplicate the entire group, rotate it, scale it, and we can create another tree very quickly. Now I'm going to get rid of that tree though, because I want to kind of keep track of the trees through naming. So how do you delete? Well, if you select an object or group, you can just select it and then hit the delete key on your keyboard. And that's going to go ahead and delete for you. Now, what about renaming? If you want to rename something, the outliner is one of the easiest ways to do it. You can double click on a name and you can just type in what you would like it to be. So I'm going to name this tree and then I'm going to give it a underscore 001 and hit enter. This is going to make it tree 001. And when I duplicate, you'll see that it creates tree 002. And if I duplicate again, 003, 004, 005. So it's a good way to number things inside of a scene. I can also name the things inside of the tree as well. I might just make this tree segment 1, copy that name, Control C, and then I could just duplicate these. Tree segment 2, tree segment 3, and I'm just hitting Control V to paste here. And then down here, I could just name this something like stump, and there we go. Our tree is all named and ready to go. That's going to give us a nice little tree that we can start working with. Now, before we start building out our scene though, let's take a look at how to color things so we don't have to go back and apply color to everything inside of our scene. But that's going to be grouping. That's going to be our first look at hierarchies, which is going to be the foundation of rigging later on. And it's also how we can name things. So be sure to save after you've grouped your tree. And let's go ahead and give you guys a challenge here. If you haven't already set up your tree, go ahead and build it if you haven't built it yet. From there, nest it into a group and name your different objects. Okay, so that's going to be your challenge for this one. Go ahead and give that a shot. Join me in the next one, and we're going to go ahead and start exploring materials and taking a look at how we can actually change the colors of things to make our scenes more beautiful and exciting.